The King, the Princess, and the Tinker by Kindt, McKenzie, illustrated by William Lowe. Chapter 6. On the Road. In all parts of the country, grass and flowers and leaves sparkled with droplets left from the night's rain. The air was sweet. Birds chirruped and warbled in the morning freshness. It was a lovely day. But the road was not as lovely as the day. It was bumpy and full of holes because all the money for fixing the roads was in the royal treasury. The coachman turned the horses onto the road going south. The coach lurched along. The king clutched his crown to keep it from slipping sideways. He scowled. He did not really want to look at his country. He sorely missed his treasure room and grumbled to think of the journey he must endure for the sake of magnificent appearances, when after all no one would ever even see him. This will be the last time, King John vowed to himself. At the other end of the road, Jack said to himself, "I shall walk so the sun will not be in my eyes. That way I shall be able to see more of the country." So he turned to the north beyond his village. The tinker walked at the edge of the road where there were no holes. At first his heart was heavy, for though he wanted to see the world, he already missed his family, and each step he took carried him further from them. Then he murmured, "But I must not grieve, for each step, though it takes me away from my loved ones, also brings me nearer to them. I have already gone for half an hour, so I am closer to them by that much. I will see them again at the end of 30 days, less 30 minutes. With that in mind, his heart and steps grew lighter, and he began to enjoy the world he had come to see. "What a fine and shining place it is," he said. His eyes grew with wonder. "The river gleams like a scoured saucepan, and the sky is even wider than the widest skillet. Surely my seeing it all will be a great adventure. I must remember to gather something of this lovely world to take back home with me." Jack began picking up pretty pebbles from the roadside. In the hour that passed, now not quite at the other end of the same road where Jack walked, the royal coach rumbled along. Behind the coach, led by the general, marched the 5,000 foot soldiers in rows 10 abreast and 500 long, stretching as far as the eye could see. None of the soldiers saw the fine, shining world, for all were looking at the ground, trying to keep from scuffing their toes on the rocks and the pebbles. They were not pleased by the dust stirred up by the royal coach. It was settling on their boots. On the top of the coach at the back, Princess Sweet Rosilla clung to the shining brass railing. Her eyes were open wider than they'd ever been, but they were fixed most of the time on her own white knuckles where her hands gripped the rail. The ride was bumpier and far more frightening than any she had ever had, even on the back of her oldest brother. She was seeing only a little of the country. The princess was not altogether pleased. It was in the coach rode King John. He put his eye to the slot between the curtains and squinted at the kingdom as the coach rolled along. For if the curtains were closed against anyone seeing him, they were also closed against his looking at the country. A narrow view the slot gave him. Little enough he could see, and none of it pleased him at all. As for Jack the Tinker, he was pleased by everything he saw. Sometimes he hummed as he walked, but more often his mouth hung open in wonder. He wondered at the clearness of the air here, and at the faint cloud of dust that had appeared over the road far ahead of him. He marveled over the pine cones and smelled the sweet flowers and gathered a handful of striped feathers from the ground. He could not bear to throw down anything that he picked up from the road, and his pockets were soon filled with pretty things. He started filling his hat. "Oh, Jack," he said to himself at last, "you are a foolish one. You're as loaded down as the miller's donkey." He sat in a ditch at the side of the road and sorted out his treasures. The bright-colored pebbles were the heaviest, so he sadly left them in a little heap beside the road. The flowers and the ferns he wove into a wreath and set them around the brim of his hat. But what should he do with the feathers, and the clump of fox fur he had found on a fence, and the pine cones, and the heather, and the gently nodding weeds gone to seed? Unable to bring himself to cast any of them away, he undid his bootlace, and with it he tied them to the ribbon of his hat. The result was unusual. "Far lovelier than any pot I've ever polished," he cried. More than pleased with his work, he settled his hat back on his head and stood up from the ditch. It was just then that King John's royal coach passed by. The 5,000-foot soldiers, 500 rows of them, 10 abreast across the road, the line of them stretching as far as the eye could see, marched behind it. Jack's mouth fell open. What a wonderful parade! Surely there are 1,000 soldiers. Their helmets gleamed like burnished kettles, and all for my pleasure alone. For, of course, everyone else had stayed indoors, lest they look by mistake upon the king. All by himself Jack stood and stared. And King John? He too stared. For as he peered through the narrow slot between the curtains, he saw rise from the roadside a hat as he had never imagined. A hat covered with flowers and feathers and ferns and fur and furzy and pine cones and gently waving weeds gone to seed. Was it some kind of crown? He opened his eyes wider than he ever had since he had begun to squint. His mouth fell open as well, and he thrust his head between the curtains out of the window to look. Alas for King John! And that's the end of chapter 6.